My pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Ania Wright. One of the wonderful things, for me at least, about working at a university is you get to interact with young people who are at such a formative time in their lives. Of course, they're often thinking about their future careers, but many are also thinking about ways to make a difference in the world, to help solve pressing societal problems. And I know that's true for many of you. Ania is a great example of someone who was thinking about this way back, well, not so far back, but while she was in school. I found out a little more about that when I realized she was thinking like this in high school. And it's obvious that her interests have continued to deepen and to broaden. She graduated nearly 4 years ago from the College of the Atlantic, where she had a strong focus on environmental policy and climate justice. After graduation, she joined the Sierra Club as a grassroots organizer. We'll hear more about this as she now works as a legislative and political specialist. She has a lot of other experience that's very relevant to issues I think we all care about. Extensive involvement in climate justice activism, as a founding member of Maine Youth for Climate Justice. She also served as the youth representative for the Maine Climate Council, and she also sits on the board of Maine Climate Action Now. Just want to add that Ania has generously offered to join us at 5 o'clock for a conversation with pizza for undergraduates. And so some students have let us know they're interested, and if you didn't, but you're still interested in joining, it's just out down the hall. That's going to start at 5 o'clock, so we look forward to having you there. For now, however, please join me in welcoming Ania to the mention section.
Thanks so much for that lovely introduction. And nice to see you all this afternoon. I'm already hungry for pizza, so hopefully yeah, big thank you to the Metro Center for hosting me, to David for reaching out, and Ruth and Carol for organizing and supporting the event, and to Linda for doing the Q&A. It's really always such a joy and a pleasure to be able to speak with a student audience, especially because that's, as David just shared, really where I got my start as a climate activist. And I did a lot of public speaking right out of college, but have since been like much more in a policy wonky space, and I'm a bit rusty, so please bear with me. But again, very excited to be here. Again, my name's Ania Wright. I use she, her pronouns. I grew up in Falmouth, Maine. I now live in Portland, occupied Abenaki territory. I attended College of the Atlantic, where I graduated in 2020, and now work with the Sierra Club. So I'm really excited to talk to you all a bit this afternoon about an issue that matters a lot to me, and that's climate justice. Throughout my talk this afternoon, I'll speak to my experiences in Maine, but also kind of what led me to end up working in Maine, which is attending 3 different UN climate conferences, where I learned about what's globally necessary for us to achieve a just and livable world, and then I'll kind of bring that back to Maine, and what I think we need to do here. So I'll start by sharing my global experience, and we'll share about like the political realities compared to what's morally and scientifically necessary for us to do internationally. And then I'll talk a bit about the role of the United States as a whole. I'll share some stories of folks that I met at negotiations, and about what the global climate justice movement is calling for. And then I'll transition into the role that I see for Maine, and I'll go over briefly what we're set out to do in Maine statutory climate goals, and then also what we need to do, more scientifically. So I'll try and wrap up in about 45 minutes, because I really value discussion and questions, and hope to be able to leave as much time and space for that as possible. But I'll jump in and get started with the term of climate justice. So I don't know about you all, but this is a term that I've heard in many different contexts, in many different spaces, and really depending on where you look, you'll find many different definitions of the term climate justice. So I think to start, it may be helpful for me to share my own personal journey with the term. I'm going to have this lovely quote from Greta Thunberg as well. So my activism journey really started when I was in high school with my school's recycling team. And it was a very classic high school recycling team. We'd like go around the hallways after school and take all the recycling bins and put them into the big dumpster outside. And that was pretty much it. And I really in high school saw the climate crisis as an issue with a few very distinct solutions. Using less, recycling more, switching to renewable energy. And any other issue that I felt was important in the high school, like anti-racism or income inequality, or healthcare for all, to name a few, they felt completely unrelated because I really wasn't learning or taught to learn in a way that was intersectional, and I didn't see those interconnections between the issues that mattered to me. So it wasn't until college that I learned the term climate justice, which to me means that the requirement of the recognition that the climate crisis was caused by failures of our political, social, and economic systems. And it demands intersectional solutions that will transform these systems and hold those responsible for the climate crisis accountable. And I really like this quote from Greta Thunberg about realizing once we've done your homework that we need new politics, we need a new economy, and a whole new way of thinking in order to address it. So now that we have a shared understanding, or at least now you know my understanding of climate justice, I'll jump into what the climate justice movement looks like on a global level. So here's some fun selfies. College of the Atlantic has a really fantastic program led by Professor Bernie Stabinsky that's taken a delegation to the UN climate conferences for over 20 years. The conferences, which are colloquially known as COPs, stand for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and annual conference of the parties. And this gathering of governments happens every year. It's been happening for longer than I've been alive. It brings around 30,000 people from all over the world together for negotiations on our global climate future. You may have heard about them most recently with COP28 in Dubai, which happened this past December. One of my favorite highlights from that is the top president saying that there was no science behind the phase out of gas and oil, which gives you maybe a good example of how these negotiations typically go. So I was lucky enough to attend COPs 24, 25, and 26, which were in Poland, Spain, and Scotland, respectively. And I attended these all with the ZOA delegation. And as someone who grew up in Maine and attended college in Maine, attending these conferences was incredibly transformative to my worldview, and I'm really incredibly grateful for the experience. That being said, the conferences were also pretty deeply heartbreaking and disappointing, and they really continue to be so to this day. And they really shaped, I'll get into this in a bit, but kind of my work in Maine and what inspired me to work on a state and local level. So I came to realize after my first COP that each year really felt like a repeat of the last year's negotiations. The UN was arguing, or different nation states were arguing over the same sticking points that I have been learning about in my classes. There was really no real action or ambition that I could see. And this was a really common theme that I came to learn of these international negotiations, where rich developed countries like the US continuously slow down negotiations in order to avoid the responsibility to lead in addressing the climate crisis, and instead continuing to protect their interests and continuing to be large emitters and profiting off of the fossil fuel industry. It was really disappointing to just hear nations block resolution after resolution, pushing for solutions that would help their economies, but at the end of the day, really failed to address the climate crisis and ultimately doom the lives of so many. I came to learn that the negotiations really weren't about protecting people; they were about protecting power and making money, keeping business as usual, and really came to find that international players are not doing enough, and that is also why I see that Maine must be a leader. And to get a bit more into the role of the U.S. in these negotiations, and then about what the climate justice movement is calling for, I'm just going to get into some numbers. So globally, when we look at emissions over time, that we see that people with the most money are also the people with the highest emissions. So while the world's richest 10% cause 50% of emissions, they also claim 52% of the world's wealth. And the world's poorest 50% contribute just 10% of global emissions and have about 8% of the world's wealth. So when we look at climate change impacts, we need money to adapt. And all that this means is that those most responsible for climate change are relatively insulated from its impacts, and those least responsible are unable to adapt. And then when we look at it from a countrywide perspective, we see that between 1850 and 2002, countries in the global north, so countries like the United States, the European Union, etc., those countries emitted 3 times as many greenhouse gas emissions as countries in the global south, like the South America, the continent of Africa, South America, and parts of Asia, where approximately 85% of the global population resides. The average CO2 emissions per capita of citizens in countries most vulnerable to climate change impacts. For example, Mozambique, the average citizen emits 0.3 metric tons per person of carbon dioxide a year. These pale in comparison to the average emissions of a person in the US, which is about 15.5 tons of CO2 per year. And of course, these all go in comparison to Taylor Swift, but that's a second note. So it's further estimated by the Climate Vulnerable Forum that the 85 lowest emitting countries of the world, who have contributed virtually nothing to the problem, will bear 40% of the economic losses and 80% of the resulting deaths due to the climate crisis. So all this to say, there are deep inequalities between those who are most responsible for the climate crisis and those who will bear the brunt of its impacts. So I really love this graph because it shows the US's fair share of climate emissions reductions. So if the US were to actually achieve its fair share of emissions reductions based on that historical context and then also the present context of the wealth that we have as a nation, we would have to reduce our emissions by 195% by 2030, which means getting to at least 70% emission reductions nationally, and then the remainder through support to developing nations. So to put this in perspective, the US currently has the goal, and note that that's a goal, not legally binding, of reducing greenhouse gas emissions 50 to 52% by 2030. And Maine has the statutory target to decrease greenhouse gas emissions 45% by 2030, which is, both of those are nowhere near that 195% goal. So all this to say, as we move into this next decade and this next iteration of the Maine Climate Plan, we need to determine not only how we as a globe can drastically reduce our emissions, but also how to do it equitably. And equity at the end of the day is about fairness. we as a country are most responsible for the climate crisis, we need to support those who are least responsible for climate change and allow them to use the remaining emissions that we have left in the atmosphere to develop. So this means it's even more important for us as a country to reduce and cut our emissions. And because of the political realities of our country, why we must be extra bold when it comes to so taking a break from the numbers and science, I feel that it's important to report both on the policy and inaction that happened in these negotiations, but also to talk about the stories of people that I met. The stories from the negotiations themselves are the same every year. The arguments are the same. The bullies are the same. So I want to share a couple stories of folks that are experiencing the climate crisis now all over the globe. And these are just some photos of a few of those folks. These photos are this one closest to me, and the top right are from Madrid, and the bottom one is from Katowice, Poland, and that's little Greta Thunberg in the far right corner. So the first person that I want to talk about, his name is Harlan Zaparas. He's a youth activist from the Marshall Islands. And he and I spoke about a recent storm that hit his home island that brought 16-foot swells to his country and forced 200 people from their island to leave. And their island is just 2 meters above sea level. They've been asked to adapt and elevate with migration as the only plan B, even though their country is responsible for 0.00001 of emissions globally. Another person that I talked to, who's actually a College of the Atlantic graduate, named Angela Valenzuela from Chile, which at the COP in Madrid, that COP was originally supposed to be in Chile, but it was moved at the last moment due to political unrest in the country. So she spoke to me about how the cameras of the world don't often look at the global south, particularly her country. In Chile, she and millions of others were protesting on the streets at that time for better quality of life, for equity, and the end of the extractivist industry that has profited off of her country's natural resources. The same extractivist culture had privatized their water, killed those who protected it, and continues to attack her people on their streets. I also spoke with Rose Whipple, who is of the Asante, Dakota, and Ho-Chunk nations. And she spoke of her struggles to fight the Line 3 tar sands oil pipeline in the Midwest, a pipeline that was approved, threatening her people and her homeland, and highlighting institutions that value corporate profit over Indigenous lives and practices. She spoke of the links that the climate crisis has to racism, colonialism, white supremacy, and sexism, emphasized that in climate action, we must be centering the Indigenous peoples who have been continuously fighting for their human rights and their ways of life, and who have lived in harmony with our world for thousands of years, and whose practices we must respect and listen to. Like 2 more stories. The next one is from Hilda Flavia, who's from Uganda, and she spoke of how the climate crisis reminds her of the deep racism and apartheid experienced by her ancestors. She spoke about how the continent of Africa is deeply cut by the actions and words of people in power, and how she thought that this COP, speaking about the COP in Madrid, was the best time for developed countries to exercise their moral duty, but how they just don't care. In a press conference, she said, "You have dreams, but we have dreams too. These dreams have turned into nightmares which are right now being negotiated by world leaders without our say, by the fossil fuel companies that are financing this COP." And then finally, I attended a side event in Madrid in the same buildings as the negotiations and listened to a talk by women farmers from Tanzania, Kenya, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And one of the speakers at the end of the talk said that in the global north, we talk about lifestyle change, using less, changing technology, and adapting. And in the global south, we talk about how to survive. And I think about this often when we talk about needing to make bold changes in the state of Maine, which to us truly are more of an inconvenience. And yes, we might not have the largest population or largest climate impact, but we have to act to protect not only our livelihoods, but also to save the lives of millions of people across the globe who are already being affected by the climate crisis and who are least responsible. Somehow my slides got out of whack, but this was a march that happened on the last day of the COP in Madrid. It was a peaceful march of over 500,000 people in the streets of Madrid, and it was led by Indigenous leaders from all over the globe. And I think that experience I really still hold near and dear. I have a memory of standing on a park bench and looking out far in front of me and far behind me, and all I could see were people all marching for the same thing. Yeah, and as I said, 500,000 people, give or take, marched that evening, which was almost half the population of Maine, demanding system change, not climate change, and pushing for climate action. And this was just a moment where I could really see that this is a movement that's growing across the globe with mass climate protests. And at that time, youth strikes breaking records consistently. All right, so I'll shift now to what repercussions this has for the state of Maine. And I'll talk a little bit more about my work here in the state. So on the one hand, coming back from these climate negotiations felt really empowering. You know, and compared to the global sphere, we have a lot to be hopeful for here because of, in general, more political will and a less complicated space than a UN negotiation. And really at the UN, I didn't feel very proud to be from the United States. But I think I did feel some pride to be from Maine, you know, a state that asks, you know, or that says Maine won't wait, and to have initiatives like the Climate Council, which has committed itself to solve the climate crisis within our state, which ultimately I hope will set a good example for the US and countries around the world. On the other hand, the issues that we see internationally are replicated here in Maine because we're operating under the same broken systems here as we are globally. So when we think about these political and power issues within the state of Maine, the same patterns tend to emerge. For example, our first climate action plan, which came out in December of 2022, and is now being rewritten. It didn't include any talk of what a fair share for Maine might look like on a global scale or at a state scale. And then, you know, these same statistics play out at the state level. The wealthiest Mainers and the largest corporations have emitted the most, and the most poverty-stricken Mainers have the greatest barriers to adapting. I like to think about, you know, a hot day in July of 2030. You ask the question, who has access to air conditioning? Who can afford the extra cost on their electric bill? Who can afford to go to the hospital if they have heat stroke? So, you know, ultimately, the environmental movement in Maine and the Maine government has not given adequate power to those most vulnerable to the climate crisis. All that to say, I think we are working towards it. You know, I think it starts with having an equity subcommittee for the Maine Climate Council, Providing stipends to folks who need it for their time to participate in projects. Or, the folks at the Maine Mitchell Center who are working with the governor's office in this next iteration of the climate plan to make sure that all voices are heard. But ultimately, what would it look like for power to be shifted in Maine from our primarily white, older, wealthy legislature to a well-paid and well-paid, primarily white environmental organizations that primarily serve Southern Maine? What would it be like to shift that to a system that actually represents and uplifts those who don't historically hold political power or who don't have access? I can share a few of my dreams on that piece. I think, coming from a youth activist space, I would love to see a Maine where young folks have a say in what the state does, where you don't have to be retired to run for office or have the time to volunteer for an organization, where rural Mainers feel just as represented as urban and Southern Mainers, where tribal sovereignty is respected and uplifted, and where BIPOC Mainers feel like they have a voice in our political process. And I think an important question to ask ourselves here is, what work do we need to do to ensure that our voices, or I say our as in mine as a white woman from Southern Maine with an environmental job, what do I need to do to ensure that my voice is not valued above others, even if I think my opinion is important? So switching gears a little bit and getting back to these systems that we're also a part of here in Maine, we're also stuck in the same economic structures and systems that are inhibiting action at the global level. The way that capitalism tells us to put growth and profit above everything else has led to our society valuing our world and people less and money and profit more. So instead of valuing our future generations, corporations and our government value profits now at the expense of our people and planet in the future. So globally, we see this as continued investment in fossil fuel infrastructure, continued fossil fuel executives attending the COP conference and having great influence, practices that we know are not in the best interest of people in the long run, but run short profits. So in Maine, I think a good example of this is the natural gas industry. And a story that I have from my work with the Sierra Club is a few years ago, Summit Natural Gas proposed a gas line going through the mid-coast. And natural or cracked gas, as we at Sierra Club like to call it, has been advertised as a bridge fuel, as something that's less expensive and has less emissions than oil. But in reality has really great health and environmental and economic impacts on ratepayers. So this project in the Midcoast was supported by large local businesses and by the town council of Belfast because they saw dollar signs with the project. A project that would stimulate the local economy and lower gas prices, or so they were told. Summit was offering a refund of up to $3,000 for those who joined the project. But then when you looked at the reality of it, cracked gas isn't even the cheapest heating option over the years. It costs on average $2,587 per year to keep the average home of fracked gas, while a heat pump powered by solar costs only $1,000 a year. Additionally, jobs in the fossil fuel industry are declining. Any job creation as a result of this project likely would have been temporary. Meanwhile, renewable energy jobs offer more long-term security and are the fastest growing occupation in the US. And as the frac gas industry continues to decline, consumers are going to be left with a useless stranded asset, and will eventually have to upgrade their systems again to run on electricity. But even despite all of those downsides, the project was given real thought. And it was canceled due to grassroots organizing and an outpouring of community action. But why did frac gas even have a chance to begin with, you might ask? Why are there frac gas representatives on the Maine Climate Council working groups? Why are people not automatically put first and foremost? And so, as part of solving the climate crisis here in Maine, we need to stop giving fossil fuel companies the benefit of the doubt. They proved quite obviously that they have no intention of being held accountable or stopping their expansion. We need to find ways to instead invest in our communities and create an economic system where people are always. I'm going to talk a bit about. Yeah. I'm going to talk shortly about social issues in the country and how they relate to climate justice. And then I'll get into just a couple of bills that were with this year. And I think I'll preface all of this by saying that today at the Maine legislature, there was a public hearing on LD 2007, which is an act to restore tribal sovereignty to the Wabanaki people. And I'll just put a plug that if you'd like to submit written testimony, you'll be happy to talk to you after this, but you're able to submit written testimony. So with that in mind, the way that the United States came to be, which was through colonial practices of displacing Native people and forcing our own Western practices on other countries, has left scars on our planet. It's led Americans to believe that they have dominion over the land and people, and has allowed for the continued destruction of our environment and the oppression of Indigenous peoples. The fact that I keep at the forefront of my mind is that despite being 5% of the global population, Indigenous communities hold about 80% of the world's biodiversity. And so I and we as colonizers have a broken relationship with the world. I appreciate this quote from Sherry Mitchell, a Wabanaki woman, and this is in her essay, Indigenous Prophecy and Mother Earth. She says that, unfortunately, a great deal of critical Indigenous knowledge has remained outside the carefully ordered categorization of Western thought, making its holistic concepts difficult to comprehend for those who have been trained to see the world in fractured pieces. It is this fractured view that has been central to the fracturing of our societies and environments. Ironically, she says, the Indigenous ways of knowing and being that European colonists saw as primitive are now actively being sought out to save our environment and mankind from the brink of extinction. So here in this region, the Wabanaki tribes, Penobscot Nation, Passamaquoddy tribe, Fulton Band of Maliseet, and Aroostook Band of Micmac, as well as the Abenaki and other tribal communities living in diaspora outside of Maine, have lived in what is now Maine for time immemorial. And this gets a little bit to the bill that had its public hearing today. Throughout those thousands of years, the tribes have lived in relationship with the land and waters here, managing natural resources so that future generations can thrive. And in just a few hundred years since the European settlers colonized Maine, the Wabanaki lost 98% of their population. They lost access to most land and waters, their ability to sustain themselves in traditional ways, and so much more. And that led to, in the 1970s, Wabanaki tribes still had legal claim to more than 1 million acres of land that were owned by private landowners in the state of Maine. And returning that land to the tribes would have likely led to extreme hostilities and never-ending legal proceedings. So the U.S. brokered a deal with the state of Maine on behalf of the tribes, known as the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act of 1980. This act was intended to provide funds and outline a process for the tribes to purchase lands to replace the land that they had unlawfully lost. In exchange, the tribes gave up their legal claim to those dispossessed lands, but due to many factors, the tribes have not actually been able to purchase nearly the amount of land that was intended by the act. So, at a time when climate change and environmental degradation are accelerating at terrifying rates due to our Western ways of living and untethered climate change, restoring the Wabanaki tribe's ability to manage tribal lands, waters, and resources will help protect all future generations. And it's just the right thing to do. So recognizing the Wabanaki tribe's inherent sovereignty is the first step to recognizing and beginning to feel the deep suffering that European settlers in the state of Maine inflicted. And again, happy to talk more deeply about this in the Q&A or provide more information about the work or the public doing today. I'll finish up on my analysis of Maine and how it relates to the global climate talks by talking a little bit about how racism has also made communities more susceptible to the climate crisis here in Maine. This includes the disproportionate impacts of poverty, housing instability, and poor healthcare access for BIPOC folks in Maine that make them more susceptible to the climate-induced disasters and environmental racism that we see here in Maine. And I think, in a more U.S. context, BIPOC communities are far more likely to face negative health impacts from racist land use, zoning, and redlining. For example, Black Americans are 75% more likely than white Americans to live in communities next to commercial facilities. And so Maine is a very white state, but in no way does that mean that we don't have racism. So in the summer of 2020, I think a prime example of this is 27.7% of COVID-19 cases, despite the fact that, or 27.7% of COVID-19 cases were Black Mainers, despite the fact that Black residents represent just 1.4% of the state's population. So that means that in 2020, if you were Black in Maine, you were 25 times more likely to get COVID-19. Maine had among the lowest rates of COVID-19 infections in the country, but the picture was dramatically different for Black residents, a growing number of whom are recent immigrants, with lower incomes, more limited access to healthcare, and less job security than before the pandemic. I'll share a quick quote from a colleague, Josh Wood, youth climate activist and racial justice activist. He said to me once that as a biracial person in Maine, activism doesn't feel like a choice, it's survival. Another quote from Mary Anise Pickler, Black climate justice activist, in her essay, Home is Always Worth It, said, in my career, I've come across a good many doomer dudes. They have books, they have panels, and they're almost always white men because only white men can afford to be lazy to quit or to quit on themselves. So all of these issues that I've just mentioned, capitalism, colonialism, racism, and extractivism, are systemic issues that we're all a part of. And without dismantling these systems, we can't solve the climate crisis, not here in Maine, not in the US, and not globally. And I see this work needing to be done at the community level, the personal level, at the state level, and at the local level. So I'm going to wrap up here. I want to end, I always tell you to end on a hopeful note, so I'm going to end with a hopeful story. about action here in Maine that ties into my role with Sierra Club. And I haven't talked too much about my role, but to speak about it briefly, as the legislative and political specialist with the Sierra Club Maine Chapter, I support our volunteer legislative and political teams. So I lobby in Augusta for our legislative priorities, and then during the election cycle, I work to endorse and support climate change candidates. And I think ultimately, I have a lot of hope here in Maine because we have more political will than we do in other states or in some other countries. We have a couple amazing models of intersectional organizing, one of which I'll talk about in a moment. And then we have a lot of leadership from young generations. So I'll end with a quick story about a bill that was worked on in 2022 with a climate education policy working group that the Sierra Club is a part of. Picture here. So we worked in 2022 on LD 1902, which was a bill to establish a pilot program to encourage climate education in Maine schools. And I don't know about all of you, I graduated high school in 2015, so things have changed, but not a ton. When I was in high school, the only climate education that I received was a small unit in biology class. And then moving into college and studying climate change and environmental law, I learned how my previous education really left me unprepared for how climate change would impact me and my generation, also the decisions that I would need to make as an adult determining my future. So the climate change education bill was a critical measure to ensure that other young people are given as much information as possible about the reality of the world that they're in. And essentially it provided funding for teachers to be able to receive training to teach about climate and created more opportunities for climate to be taught in an intersectional way in school. So not just in the biology class, but in math classes, in history classes, in social studies classes, etc. And really this process was one of the most intentional and rewarding experiences that I've had in my career. The coalition that we built was centered around the needs and voices of educators and young people, and that really led to our success. It all started when we held an in-person planning meeting in the summer ahead of the session, and we created, this giant poster of our plan, citing potential allies and adversaries, and it really felt like the beginning of something big. And we ultimately came together because this group, the Nature-Based Education Consortium, does an annual survey, and they found that the number one issue that teachers were facing was not having enough resources to teach about climate change. So I think, one of the most memorable moments from this experience was a meeting that we had with members of the Appropriations Committee, which is the committee in the legislature that determines, the ultimate funding of bills. And we brought a bunch of youth members from the Climate Education Working Group, and they were successfully able to state their case and advocate directly for their futures. And I believe that meeting in particular was critical for the ultimate funding of the project or of the bill. And I think it's just a fantastic example of the potential that we have here in Maine to start to deconstruct some of these systems and reframe the way that we advocate in order to reach ultimate policy that is centered in climate. So to wrap up, addressing the climate crisis is going to take everyone. And I think, it's critical that you are all here today to share, your knowledge, perspective, and expertise because ultimately this climate change is inevitable. The science is pretty clear, and we've seen it already this winter. But justice is absolutely not inevitable, and that's what I personally strive to work for every day to ensure a safe, livable future for all of us in the state of Maine. And my experiences from the global to local to myself make it clear that we must determine that future now for ourselves and not wait for international negotiations to save us, but work here in Maine. So I'll wrap up there and do this. Thanks so much.
Great talk, wonderful talk, and just so much that we are all learning from you. You mentioned that you really like student audiences. You enjoy talking to student audiences. What's your hope? People want to know about how student audiences will use this information, and how do you decide what information you should present in that case?
Wow, what a meta question. How do I decide what to talk about, and what do I hope people take away? I think at the end of the day, or at least putting myself in all of your shoes for a second, potentially, all of you students in the room. I think when I was an undergrad, I really didn't have any idea that I had a voice in the state of Maine, or could make my voice heard in the state of Maine. And I think something that's special about how our state government works is that our legislators represent a relatively small amount of the population compared to other states. And also we have a volunteer legislature that's very accessible to the public, and really listens to constituents. And so I'd encourage folks to dive, if you're interested in policy and that's the way that you want to make your voice heard. I think there's a lot of opportunity here in the state of Maine to really make your voice heard. And then in terms of how do I decide what I want to talk about, I think as I said at the top, my role now is very analytical, and I'm like writing testimony all day or talking to legislators and often in the weeds of a particular issue. And so it's always, a special experience to be able to zoom out a bit and both take it as an opportunity to reflect a bit on how my worldview may have changed in the past few years, but also, get grounded and centered in the reason that I am doing this work in the first place.
Thank you. David, can I go ahead and ask another?
Why don't you do one more, Linda,
Okay.
and then I'll turn here in the room.
Great. So, someone has asked, can you elaborate a bit about LD 1902 and what is happening in Maine schools now with regard to this idea?
That's a great question. So yeah, LD 1902 passed in 2022 and was funded. And there's now a amazing staff person at the Department of Education that is working on distributing the funds that were appropriated to start doing some of that teacher training. So it's still in the beginning phases, but the hope is that it'll be refunded again in this after the next election, and that it's a program that will continue to grow. And it's a program that's based off of a program called Climb Time in Washington State. And that's a program that started in a very similar way, and now has reached a vast majority of educators in Washington State. So the hope is that this is a program that is just the beginning and will continue to grow.
Linda, can I have a turn?
You sure can.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was interested in, so recent projections have indicated that the state of Maine is growing rather rapidly by our standards, especially since the COVID pandemic. We've seen a large influx of internal migrants. And while those people are typically young and diverse, they're also typically very affluent and are coming into the southern counties. How do you think that will affect the the political aspects of climate justice moving forward? Because on the one hand, they're generally young, and young people are correlated with being climate voters, but on the other hand, they have significant amounts of money, so that could be threatening to populations who could very easily get priced out because Maine doesn't have gentrification controls because we've never had to.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I think one that us as like an environmental movement are starting to wrestle with a little bit. And I think gets back to like what I was talking about with the United States as a whole and in the global perspective of, and this is true in the United States too, of wealthy folks have larger carbon footprints and larger impacts than folks with lower incomes. And so, yeah, and it is kind of, a politically wonky question in terms of bringing more climate voters to the state. So I don't know if I have a very direct answer for you, but I think, part of it may be passing some gentrification control type policy within our state. I think, thinking intentionally about zoning and how we are growing as a state, especially in terms of housing, is a huge part of that as well. How do we make sure that that we're protecting low income folks in Maine, both in our cities and rurally? Yeah, I don't have a straightforward answer, and I think it's something that a lot of us are definitely chewing on, but a really important critical question as we consider, how to move forward in a way that's just and equitable. And then, a lot of folks are moving here from out of state because of climate change. There are some colleagues from Massachusetts who have moved here because of climate change. So I think definitely a good question. Yeah.
Linda, you want to, your turn?
Sure, thank you. So one of the great things of all the many great things that you had to say is you talked about the importance of intersectional solutions and intersectional organizing. Many people puzzle a bit about what that means. Could you give an example or two or someplace people might look to better understand what that means? Thank you.
Yeah, so like better understand what the term intersectional is referring to.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, it's like the term climate justice, like depending on where you look, you might get a different answer. But I like to think of, well, actually, I think your question is a great example of intersectionality. Of how do you take this big problem that has effects on many different parts of our world, from politics to economics to social issues. How do you take that big of an issue and make sure that you're addressing it in a way that gets to the root cause of all those various things that it touches? Yeah, thinking about things like a web rather than different buckets.
Thank you. David, can we ask another one?
Yeah, let's do one more.
Okay. So your slides were great. And as people watch it, they're wondering, like, who would you show them to? And in particular, when you give talks to children or to elders or to new parents, what would you focus on in terms of your slides, or what you would emphasize? Same thing for each group, different things?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's funny. Right before I came here, I have a colleague who's a teacher at Orono Middle School, and I was speaking to a middle school class about a very similar topic. They have an assignment to write testimony this semester, and so we were talking about the legislative process. And I think, I mean, I do change some things, but ultimately, I think especially talking to youth and young folks, they kind of know what's happening, and they kind of just want to be told, straight up what to do about it. And I think in terms of my slides and the kind of meat of my presentation, I might shorten things or change things or put in different examples, but at the end of the day, the meat of it is still the same.
Thank you.
Linda, if I can just, I guess mostly for the audience in the room, or somebody on campus, perhaps that is Zooming, can't be in the room right now. An hour from now, pizza in room 105 with a longer conversation, or hang around now and we'll get it started early. But thanks again, Ania, for one.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Wonderful talk. Thank you.